The train pulled into the platform with a soft, metallic sigh, its windows fogged slightly from the drizzle outside. The rain had been falling all afternoon, not a storm, but a gentle, persistent hush that wrapped the city in quiet melancholy. Mira stepped onto the train, her coat damp at the shoulders, a woolen scarf wrapped snugly around her neck. She wasn't late, she wasn't rushing, but she carried a weight that didn't show in her pace, only in the way her eyes scanned the nearly full carriage, as if searching for something beyond just a seat. Life had felt numb lately. Her mornings were colorless. Her nights were quiet. She'd been walking through her days like someone moving through a fog, seeing everything but feeling nothing. Then she saw it. An empty seat near the window beside a man who looked absorbed in the world outside. Something about him made her pause. He had the kind of presence that wasn't loud or attention-seeking, but grounded, like he belonged there in the silence. His hair was dark and slightly tousled, his coat well-worn but clean, and his hands rested calmly on his lap. She couldn't see his face fully, but she felt something stir. Not recognition, but curiosity. Maybe even a flicker of something warmer. She slid into the seat beside him, quietly, careful not to disturb. He didn't turn, just kept looking out the window, the blurred countryside slipping by like a dream. Mira opened the book she always carried, but didn't read a single word. Her eyes wandered back to him, his stillness, the curve of his jaw, the faint frown that lived between his brows. She wondered who he was, where he was going, and what kind of story was playing out behind those thoughtful eyes. She wasn't trying to start anything. Not love, not a conversation. But for the first time in a long time, her heart beat with the quiet thrill of maybe. Then, as if he could hear her thoughts, he spoke. His voice was low, calm, a kind of steady warmth wrapped in velvet. Have you ever watched the world blur? Bye, he said, not turning to her but speaking to the air between them. And wondered if you're missing something by standing still. The question struck her like soft lightning. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't small talk. It was the kind of question that came from a place of knowing, from someone who had stood still long enough to ache for motion. She turned her head toward him, surprised by how natural it felt to reply. Every day, she said, her voice quiet, but sure. He turned then, slowly, his eyes meeting hers. Deep brown, kind eyes, with something broken but beautiful behind them. Their gazes locked, and in that second, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't magic. It wasn't fate. It was simpler and more honest. It was two lonely souls, brushed by chance, recognizing the familiar ache in someone else's. Silence. The train rumbled on, but for Mira, time slowed. She wasn't thinking of her destination anymore. She wasn't thinking about the rain or her unread book or the messages waiting on her phone. She was thinking about this man. This quiet stranger with sad eyes and a voice that stirred something long dormant inside her. She had no idea what would happen next. But for the first time in a long time, she wanted to find out. And beside her, Armin, though she didn't yet know his name, felt the exact same thing. His name was Armin. Mira learned it when the silence between them finally gave way to something softer, not noise, but conversation. Not forced, Not shallow. Just honest. Like waves lapping at the shore. She didn't even remember how it began. One moment they were two strangers watching. The rain, the next. He was telling her about a book he had just finished. Something about finding pieces of yourself in unexpected places. She nodded, curious, letting her guard fall without quite realizing it. It had been so long since someone spoke to her like this. Like her thoughts mattered. Like there was more to her than what people saw. They talked in fragments, quiet pauses, between sentences giving each word space to breathe. He didn't fill the silence the way most people did, nervously or with small talk. No, he listened. Mira found herself saying things she hadn't planned to, about her work, her favorite music, even the dreams she'd tucked away for a later that never came. He looked at her when she spoke, really looked. And when he did, it felt like she was being seen in a way that made her heart ache a little. The train rocked gently, the rhythm of the rails like a lullaby for the soul. Outside, the rain streaked the windows in silver threads. Inside, something delicate and warm was blooming in the space between two strangers, who felt less like strangers now. Then he asked, not casually, but with a kind of vulnerability she didn't expect. "Are you married?" It was the kind of question that could have shattered the mood, but it didn't. His tone wasn't invasive. It was searching, maybe even hopeful. She met his eyes, and without hesitation answered, "Was." The word hung in the air for a moment, soft and bare. She didn't owe him her story, but something about Armin, the way his gaze didn't flinch, the way his presence felt safe, made her offer it anyway. She spoke in low tones, words carefully chosen, about a husband who had once been everything, and then became a distant echo. About the loneliness of sharing a bed with someone who'd stopped hearing her, seeing her, loving her. It wasn't a bitter story, just a quiet one. The kind of heartbreak that doesn't scream. It just lingers. Armin didn't interrupt. He didn't say sorry or try to fix anything. He just listened. And somehow that was everything. Then, slowly, he opened his own door. Told her about a woman he'd loved years ago. Not some wild, tragic breakup. Just two lives that grew in opposite directions. He still remembered the way she smelled in the mornings. The way she used to trace circles on the back of his hand when she was thinking. There was a softness in his voice when he spoke her name. And Mira didn't feel jealousy, only empathy. They were both carrying memories like half-folded letters, unfinished, but never forgotten. Their hands rested near each other on the seat, not touching, but close. Mira felt the electricity of it, the gentle awareness of another human being, sitting beside her, one who saw her not as a broken thing, but as someone still capable of beginning again. The train moved forward, but Mira's heart stayed still, hovering between the past she couldn't rewrite and the stranger who felt like a chapter she hadn't expected to read. Neither of them said what they were feeling. But the silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of questions, of longing, and the slow, careful unfurling of something that felt dangerously close to hope. The train slowed suddenly, pulling into a quiet rural station wrapped in gray mist. The speaker above them crackled to life, announcing a delay. Mira looked up, surprised. The rain outside had grown steadier, blurring the world into watercolor. The train wasn't moving, and neither were they. At least not for the next hour. She turned to Armin, who let out a soft chuckle, the first lightness she'd seen on his face since they met. "Seems the universe wants us to stay a little longer," he said, his voice carrying a quiet playfulness that made her smile in spite of herself. Mira didn't mind the pause. For once, she didn't want to get to her destination. She wanted to stay right here, with this stranger who somehow felt more familiar than people she'd known for years. They left their seats and wandered down the aisle toward the cafe car, the warm smell of coffee and pastries filling the air like comfort. They found a booth near the window and sat across from each other. The world outside was cold and wet, but here, in this little pocket of suspended time, there was warmth. Something unspoken passed between them, something softer than words. She stirred her tea slowly, watching the steam curl upward. He watched her, not in a way that made her shrink, but in a way that made her feel seen. She wasn't sure when the shift happened, but somewhere between shared stories and sips of tea, Mira stopped feeling like she was passing time and started feeling like time had stopped just for this. They talked more freely now, laughed at odd things. Armin told her about how he once got lost in Venice trying to find a bookstore he never did find, and ended up having the best pizza of his life instead. Mira told him about her childhood dream of writing poetry in Paris, and how that dream had turned into late nights doing accounting spreadsheets instead. He didn't mock her for it. He just listened, and then said, "It's still in you, that dream. I can see it in your eyes." It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her like that. Not about what she did, but who she was. Her cheeks, flushed with something that wasn't embarrassment. It was warmth, maybe even longing. They returned to their seats as the train prepared to move again. The moment felt fragile, like the flickering end of a candle that had burned longer than expected. Mira sat beside him, and this time, her arm brushed his. The contact was brief, accidental, but the spark it lit inside her lingered. Armin didn't pull away. Neither did she. Their shoulders touched, just barely. The kind of closeness that wasn't bold, but tender. Mira's breath caught in her throat. Not because of fear, but because of almost. The feeling of being on the edge of something beautiful and not yet knowing how to name it. And yet, despite all they had shared, a question lingered between them like fog over the tracks. What happens? When the train stops? Would this connection, this gentle unfolding of hearts, vanish like morning mist the moment the city came into view? Mira turned to him, wanting to ask, wanting to say something. But the words caught in her chest. She was afraid of breaking the moment, or worse, of hoping for too much. Armin looked away, toward the window, his jaw slightly clenched. She could feel it then. He was scared too. Not of her, not of this, but of how real it suddenly felt. And neither of them knew what to do with a feeling that had arrived so quietly, and yet carried the weight of something that could change everything. The train began to slow once more, the rhythmic hum beneath, them softening into a final exhale. Mira stared out the window, her reflection barely visible in the rain-kissed glass. Drops slid downward like quiet goodbyes. The city had arrived. The station lights blurred through the drizzle, and with them, the quiet pressure in Mira's chest returned, a feeling like time running out. Across from her, Armand had gone quiet too. Their laughter from earlier now lingered in the air like perfume from another hour, delicate and fading. Neither of them moved. Neither wanted to. Because once they stood up, once they stepped off the train, they both knew it might all dissolve. The warmth, the connection, the possibility that two people who met by accident had somehow started something real. Mira's fingers curled around the strap of her bag, her heart thudding unevenly. She could still feel the ghost of his arm brushing hers. She could still hear his voice when he talked about dreams and loss and the ache of almost love. And now, as they neared the final stop, she couldn't help but wonder if it had all just been a moment. Something beautiful, fleeting, and over. But then, he turned to her. His eyes searched hers, like he was trying to find a version of himself, reflected there. "I don't want this to be the end," he said, his voice low, almost uncertain, like a man afraid to want too much. Mira's breath caught. It wasn't a dramatic confession. It wasn't a grand romantic gesture, but it was honest, and somehow that made it more powerful than anything rehearsed. He wanted her to know, wanted to say it while they still had time. She looked at him, really looked. His guarded heart, the pain in his past, the kindness in his eyes. And she realized something. She didn't want it to end either. "Then let's not let it be," she whispered. The train came to a full stop. Around them, people were gathering their things, saying polite goodbyes, moving on. But Armin and Mira stayed still for a moment longer, suspended in something deeper. As they stepped onto the platform, the rain greeted them like an old friend. Not harsh, just steady, the kind that wraps around you gently like a song you used to know. She turned to him and spoke softly, almost afraid the words would sound too fragile out loud. "I live just across the bridge. There's a coffee shop I go to sometimes, when I need to feel like myself again." He smiled at that, the corners of his mouth turning upward with something like hope. "Then maybe I'll find myself there too." They walked side by side beneath the station's overhang, their steps unhurried. For a moment, Mira brushed her hand against his. Not fully, not yet. Just enough to let him know the door was open. He didn't pull away. Instead, his hand gently closed over hers, warm and sure. It wasn't possessive. It wasn't rushed. It was the quiet answer to every unspoken question between them. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. The promise was already there, in the way their fingers intertwined, in the way they lingered on the platform like people who suddenly had nowhere else they'd rather be. Sometimes beginnings come softly. They don't announce themselves, with fireworks or fate. Sometimes they arrive in the seat beside you on a rainy afternoon, wearing a tired coat and carrying a story not so different from your own. And if you're lucky enough to listen, they stay.